The truth has a strange habit of arriving before justice does. The only difference is whether someone is paying attention when it appears. Morning sunlight reflected across the polished stone entrance of the Jefferson County Courthouse as attorneys, clerks, and visitors crossed the wide front steps carrying briefcases, legal folders, and cups of coffee. Security officers greeted familiar faces while reporters prepared for another routine day outside one of the busiest courthouses in the state. Among the steady flow of people, one man walked quietly toward the entrance wearing a charcoal overcoat over a navy business suit. His pace was unhurried, his expression calm, and his attention focused on the building ahead rather than the crowd surrounding him. Nothing about him suggested status. He looked like another professional arriving early for work. Officer Ethan Walker had already spent 3 hours on duty. The morning had been uneventful until dispatch mentioned that a person matching a vague description connected to an unrelated inquiry had been seen near the courthouse district. The information was incomplete, but Ethan believed acting quickly prevented problems before they began. As the unknown man approached the security plaza, Ethan stepped into his path with practiced confidence. "Sir, I need to speak with you for a moment." The man immediately stopped walking. "Of course, officer. How can I help you?" His voice remained steady, respectful, and completely cooperative. Ethan studied him for several seconds before asking for identification. "May I see some identification, please?" The man nodded politely. "Certainly. My wallet is inside my coat pocket. I would simply ask to retrieve it slowly." Several people nearby slowed their pace, sensing an unusual conversation unfolding only a few feet from the courthouse entrance. A law student carrying several casebooks paused near the fountain. A television photojournalist adjusted the angle of his shoulder camera while preparing to film the courthouse exterior. A local citizen standing across the street lifted a mobile phone, intending only to capture routine footage for a neighborhood news page. None of them imagined their cameras were already preserving every word. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The man complied immediately. "I understand." There was no frustration in his voice, no argument, no resistance, only patience. Ethan interpreted that calmness as unusual rather than reassuring. "Turn around," he instructed. Without hesitation, the man slowly followed every instruction exactly as given. A courthouse security officer several yards away noticed the encounter, but assumed the city officer was handling an ordinary investigative stop. Nearby pedestrians watched quietly without understanding what had prompted the situation. The man looked toward Ethan with composed eyes before speaking again. "Officer, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. I would appreciate the opportunity to explain." Ethan shook his head. "You can explain after I finish my investigation." The man gave a slight nod. "Very well." The photojournalist continued recording the courthouse entrance without interruption. The citizen's phone camera remained fixed on the interaction from across the sidewalk. Above them, multiple courthouse security cameras quietly captured the same scene from different angles. Every movement, every instruction, every response. None of the recording devices favored one person over another. They simply preserved the facts exactly as they occurred. The man took one slow breath before speaking once more, his voice still calm enough that only those closest could hear. "Officer, every decision we make in public becomes part of someone else's understanding of justice." Ethan answered without hesitation. "My responsibility is to maintain order, and mine," the man replied gently, "is to respect the law, just as I hope every public servant does." Ethan stepped closer, convinced he remained fully in control of the situation. Around them, the courthouse plaza had grown noticeably quieter. Conversations faded. Footsteps slowed. Curious eyes followed the encounter. Yet the man never raised his voice, never challenged the officer, and never attempted to assert who he was. Instead, he stood with remarkable composure, allowing events to unfold exactly as they were happening. Across the street, the small red recording light on the television camera continued glowing. The phone held by the citizen never stopped recording. High above the entrance, courthouse surveillance cameras silently documented every second. Long before anyone understood the identity of the quiet man standing outside the courthouse, the evidence had already begun writing the story that no one would later be able to change. 35 minutes earlier, the courthouse district had looked no different from any other weekday morning. Delivery trucks unloaded office supplies along the curb, while attorneys crossed the plaza reviewing legal briefs before the first hearings of the day. Judge Marcus Bennett preferred arriving early, not because anyone expected it, but because quiet mornings allowed him to observe the community he served before the courthouse filled with schedules and formal proceedings. He parked his sedan several blocks away instead of using the reserved judicial parking area. It was a habit he had developed years earlier. Walking through the neighborhood reminded him that justice was not created inside courtrooms alone. It began on sidewalks, in coffee shops, and during ordinary conversations between people who would never know his title. Wearing a charcoal overcoat over a navy business suit, he stopped at a small family-owned coffee shop where the owner greeted every customer by name whenever possible. Since Marcus visited only occasionally, she simply smiled and said, "Good morning, sir." The usual dark roast. Marcus nodded warmly. "That sounds perfect. Thank you." While waiting, he noticed an elderly man struggling to gather several folders that had slipped from a worn leather briefcase. Without hesitation, Marcus knelt beside him, carefully stacked the papers in order, and handed the briefcase back with both hands. "I appreciate that," the man said gratefully. Marcus smiled. "We all need a little help sometimes." A young law student standing nearby quietly watched the exchange. She had no idea she was observing one of the most respected judges in the state. She simply saw a stranger offering kindness without expecting recognition. Coffee in hand, Marcus continued toward the courthouse at an unhurried pace. He paused briefly to admire the courthouse steps where generations of citizens had entered seeking fairness, accountability, and hope. Every time he approached those doors, he reminded himself that the robe he would wear later represented responsibility rather than status. He believed titles should never arrive before character. Across the street, Officer Ethan Walker had already completed several routine patrols. Dispatch had recently shared limited information about an individual connected to an inquiry somewhere within the downtown district. The description was incomplete and uncertain, but Ethan convinced himself that acting immediately was better than waiting for more information. Years of confidence had slowly become instinct, and instinct sometimes moved faster than careful verification. He noticed Marcus approaching alone with a briefcase and coffee in hand. To Ethan, unfamiliar often deserved closer attention. To Marcus, another conversation with law enforcement was simply another opportunity to cooperate respectfully. As he neared the courthouse entrance, he slowed naturally when he saw the officer approaching. "Good morning," Marcus said with an easy smile. Ethan acknowledged the greeting with a brief nod before asking him to stop. Nearby courthouse employees continued walking, assuming it was an ordinary interaction. A television crew preparing a report about upcoming hearings positioned a camera across the plaza to capture general courthouse activity. Their equipment remained recording while they adjusted microphones and lighting. On a nearby light pole, courthouse security cameras quietly observed the entrance from multiple angles exactly as they did every business day. Marcus glanced briefly toward the courthouse clock. His first hearing would begin in less than 1 hour, leaving plenty of time to cooperate before changing into his judicial robe. He never considered introducing himself immediately, because he believed every citizen should receive the same respectful treatment regardless of profession. If the interaction remained professional, his title would never become relevant. As Ethan began asking questions, Marcus answered each one calmly and directly. Every response reflected patience rather than defensiveness. Every movement was deliberate. Every word remained courteous. Yet with each passing moment, Ethan became more convinced that hesitation to immediately produce identification justified additional scrutiny. Neither man raised his voice. Neither attracted attention through volume. Instead, the growing tension came from the sharp contrast between one man relying upon assumptions and another relying upon quiet confidence. Around them, pedestrians slowed almost without realizing it. The courthouse doors opened and closed as employees entered for work. Above the plaza, the silent cameras continued preserving every second while the morning sun reflected across polished stone and glass. No one standing nearby realized they were watching the opening moments of a story that would soon challenge how an entire community understood authority, professionalism, and the importance of judging actions only after the facts were fully known. Officer Ethan Walker maintained a professional tone, But every new answer from the quiet man seemed only to deepen his uncertainty rather than resolve it. "Where are you headed this morning?" he asked. Marcus Bennett looked toward the courthouse entrance before returning his attention to the officer. "I have business inside the building." His response was truthful, concise, and delivered without hesitation. Ethan noticed the expensive briefcase, the polished shoes, and the calm confidence with which Marcus carried himself. Instead of interpreting those details as signs of professionalism, he viewed them as reasons to continue asking questions. "Can anyone inside confirm why you are here?" Ethan asked. Marcus nodded slightly. "Yes, several people can." Ethan folded his arms. "Then I would rather verify that after I understand exactly who you are." Marcus remained composed. "I understand your responsibility, officer, and I will cooperate." Around them, the courthouse plaza continued waking to another ordinary weekday. Attorneys greeted one another near the front steps. A maintenance employee adjusted small American flags lining the entrance after an overnight breeze had shifted them. Reporters prepared notes for scheduled hearings expected later that morning. None of them realized the quiet conversation near the security area would soon become the center of everyone's attention. Marcus carefully held his coffee cup in one hand, while keeping the other visible exactly as instructed. He never interrupted. He never argued. He simply answered each question with patience. Ethan requested identification once again. "I would like to retrieve my wallet now," Marcus said calmly. "It is inside the left pocket of my overcoat." Ethan considered the request for a moment before responding. "Not yet." Marcus gave a respectful nod. "Very well." The exchange remained civil, yet an uncomfortable silence settled over the plaza. A young courthouse intern whispered to a colleague that the gentleman being questioned looked strangely familiar, although she could not remember from where. Nearby, the television camera continued capturing wide shots of the courthouse entrance as producers discussed their morning schedule. The camera operator never stopped recording because the courthouse itself remained the subject of the assignment. Above them, fixed security cameras quietly documented every angle without emotion or opinion. Marcus glanced briefly at the courthouse clock once more. There was still enough time before the morning docket began, but he knew other judges, clerks, attorneys, and litigants would soon expect him to arrive. Even so, he refused to mention his position. Throughout his judicial career, he had often reminded young lawyers that respect should never depend upon titles. If courtesy disappeared the moment someone seemed ordinary, then it had never been genuine respect in the first place. Ethan received another short radio update that offered no meaningful clarification. The description remained incomplete, and the information failed to identify anyone standing before him. Instead of reducing the uncertainty, the transmission reinforced Ethan's belief that continuing the stop was the safest decision. He thanked dispatch and focused again on Marcus. "Please remain here while I verify a few things." Marcus answered with the same steady voice he had used since the first greeting. "I will remain exactly where you ask." A courthouse security officer looked toward the scene from inside the front lobby, but saw no immediate reason to intervene. Interactions between local officers and visitors occasionally happened outside the entrance, and nothing at that moment suggested anything extraordinary. Several pedestrians slowed long enough to watch before continuing on their way. Others assumed the man being questioned must have done something to attract official attention. Human nature often encouraged conclusions long before evidence appeared. Marcus seemed to understand that reality better than anyone standing there. He looked briefly across the plaza where sunlight reflected from the courthouse windows, and then quietly said, almost as though reminding himself rather than anyone else, "The law earns public trust one decision at a time." Ethan heard the remark, but did not respond. His attention remained fixed on procedure as he understood it. Neither man realized that inside the courthouse, a judicial assistant had already noticed the empty chambers and begun wondering why Judge Marcus Bennett had not yet arrived. Within minutes, routine curiosity would become urgent concern, and a search would quietly begin for the one person everyone expected to be seated behind the bench before the first case of the morning was called. Inside the courthouse, the first signs that something was wrong appeared almost too ordinary to attract immediate concern. Judge Marcus Bennett's judicial assistant, Emily Foster, reviewed the morning calendar for the third time before looking toward the hallway outside his chambers. Judge Bennett had built a reputation for arriving early enough to personally review every case scheduled before the court. During nearly 15 years on the bench, he had rarely been late, and when unavoidable delays occurred, he always called ahead. Emily checked her watch again before dialing his office extension. No answer. She tried his cell phone. The call went directly to voicemail. Assuming he might already be inside the building speaking with courthouse staff, she walked through the hallway, greeting clerks and bailiffs while quietly asking whether anyone had seen him arrive. Each answer was the same. Not yet. In courtroom 3, attorneys organized exhibits and arranged legal documents across counsel tables while clients waited nervously for proceedings to begin. The courtroom deputy glanced toward the empty bench with growing curiosity. The morning docket was full, and dozens of people had adjusted work schedules, childcare, and travel plans to appear before the court. Delays affected far more than calendars. They affected families, businesses, and lives. Outside, Marcus Bennett remained exactly where Officer Ethan Walker had instructed him to stand. His coffee had grown cold in his hand, yet he showed no sign of irritation. Every request from the officer had been followed without hesitation. Every question had received a respectful answer. A small crowd now watched from a comfortable distance, not because anyone had witnessed dramatic behavior, but because uncertainty naturally attracted attention. Some quietly speculated that the man must have been involved in a serious investigation. Others simply waited to understand what was happening before forming an opinion. Marcus appreciated the difference. He had spent much of his career reminding juries that patience often revealed truths that assumptions concealed. Ethan continued speaking into his radio, requesting additional information while carefully observing the man standing before him. The responses remained frustratingly incomplete. Nothing confirmed his suspicions, yet nothing immediately disproved them either. Believing caution remained appropriate, Ethan decided to continue waiting for verification rather than ending the encounter too soon. Across the plaza, the television camera remained pointed toward the courthouse entrance as the news crew prepared a segment about upcoming public hearings. Their wide-angle framing unintentionally included the entire interaction without focusing on any individual. Nearby, a college student who had been recording architectural footage for a class project slowly lowered the camera for a moment before deciding to continue filming. The courthouse itself had been the intended subject, but the unexpected encounter unfolding near the entrance had naturally become part of the morning landscape. Inside the building, Emily Foster's concern became more urgent. She contacted the courthouse security desk. "Has Judge Bennett already entered through another entrance this morning?" she asked. The supervisor checked the routine access log before replying that no judicial entrance had been used under his credentials. That answer immediately changed the conversation. The supervisor contacted additional security personnel, not because anyone believed something dangerous had occurred, but because a respected judge had unexpectedly failed to appear minutes before court was scheduled to begin. Quietly, without alarming the public, courthouse staff began looking throughout the building. Back outside, Ethan noticed several courthouse employees glancing toward the interaction with puzzled expressions. One employee paused as though trying to recognize Marcus before continuing inside. Marcus followed the movement with his eyes, but said nothing. He believed interruptions would only complicate the situation further. Instead, he calmly asked, "Officer, may I ask whether there has been any new information?" Ethan answered honestly, "Not yet." Marcus nodded. "Then I appreciate your willingness to verify the facts before reaching a conclusion." The response caught Ethan slightly off guard. He had expected frustration after the growing delay, yet the man standing before him continued demonstrating remarkable patience. Neither realized that only a few hundred feet away courthouse administrators, security supervisors, and judicial staff were now quietly comparing schedules, reviewing entrance cameras, and searching for the missing judge whose absence had suddenly become the most important question inside the building. Every passing minute drew those two worlds closer together, and neither could remain separate for much longer. Within the courthouse, quiet concern turned into organized urgency. Emily Foster walked quickly toward the office of the chief administrator, carrying the morning schedule in one hand and her phone in the other. "Judge Bennett has never missed a calendar call without notice," she said. "Something is not right." The administrator immediately agreed. Rather than assuming the worst, he instructed courthouse security to check every public entrance, every employee entrance, and every security camera covering the building perimeter. At the same time, the clerk responsible for opening courtroom 3 informed the attorneys that the morning session would begin with a brief delay. No explanation was offered because no one yet understood what had happened. Outside, Officer Ethan Walker remained convinced he was making the responsible decision by waiting for additional verification. The man standing before him continued to cooperate without complaint, never attempting to leave, never raising his voice, and never demanding special treatment. Marcus Bennett simply stood quietly, observing the familiar courthouse where he had spent years reminding juries that patience often revealed truth more reliably than assumptions ever could. He glanced toward the American flag above the entrance as it moved gently in the morning breeze. Justice, he once told a graduating law school class, is measured most clearly during ordinary moments, because those are the moments when character speaks before titles do. Those words returned to him now with unexpected clarity. A courthouse bailiff stepped outside to answer a personal phone call and immediately noticed the gathering near the entrance. From that distance, he could not clearly identify the man speaking with Officer Walker, but something about his posture seemed familiar. He watched for another few seconds before returning inside, uncertain whether his instinct meant anything at all. Meanwhile, Emily Foster contacted the head of courthouse security once again. "Please review the exterior cameras beginning 40 minutes ago," she requested. Judge Bennett usually enters through the public plaza after stopping for coffee. The supervisor replayed the footage from the main entrance. At first, the recording appeared completely routine. Lawyers arrived carrying briefcases. Court employees greeted one another. Visitors entered through security screening. Then the image showed Marcus Bennett approaching the courthouse with a coffee cup in one hand and a briefcase in the other. Seconds later, Officer Walker stepped into his path. The supervisor leaned closer to the monitor. "Pause that," he quietly said. Another security officer entered the room and immediately recognized the face on the screen. "That is Judge Bennett." The room fell silent. They continued watching the footage. Everything appeared calm. The conversation remained professional. No one displayed aggression. Yet the simple fact remained impossible to ignore. The judge everyone inside the courthouse had been searching for was standing only yards from the front entrance. The supervisor immediately picked up his radio. "Locate Captain Michael Reed. Ask him to meet me at the main plaza immediately." No alarm was sounded. No dramatic announcement echoed through the courthouse. Instead, experienced professionals understood the importance of approaching the situation carefully and respectfully while first gathering the complete facts. Outside, none of those developments were visible. Marcus remained composed while Ethan waited for another response from dispatch. Several members of the growing crowd quietly wondered why the conversation had lasted so long. The television crew continued recording ordinary courthouse activity, unaware that their wide-angle footage had unintentionally documented nearly every minute of the encounter. Across the street, the college student adjusted the camera tripod for a clearer view of the courthouse architecture, unknowingly preserving another uninterrupted perspective of the same scene. 3 independent recordings now existed, each capturing identical events from different angles. No narrator shaped them. No opinion altered them. They simply preserved what happened exactly as it unfolded. Inside the building, Captain Michael Reed watched the security footage only once before heading briskly toward the front entrance. He recognized Judge Marcus Bennett immediately, but he also recognized something even more important. Before anyone reached conclusions, before anyone offered explanations, and before anyone defended a single decision, the cameras had already become silent witnesses. Whatever happened next, the facts had been preserved long before anyone realized how significant this ordinary morning was about to become. Captain Michael Reed stepped through the courthouse doors with the measured pace of someone who understood that calm decisions carried more authority than hurried ones. 2 courthouse security supervisors followed several steps behind him, careful not to draw unnecessary attention from the growing crowd gathered across the plaza. Reed had already watched enough of the exterior security footage to recognize both the man standing quietly beside Officer Ethan Walker and the sequence of events that had unfolded during the previous several minutes. As he approached, Marcus Bennett met his eyes with the same composed expression he had maintained since the encounter began. There was no visible frustration, no attempt to explain ahead of anyone else, and no request for special treatment. Reed stopped a respectful distance away before speaking. "Good morning, Your Honor." The words seemed almost to suspend the motion of the plaza itself. Conversations nearby faded into silence. The courthouse employees who had followed Reed exchanged brief glances, while several attorneys standing on the front steps instinctively turned toward Marcus. Ethan looked from Reed to the man he had been questioning, searching both faces for some indication that he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Marcus answered with a polite nod. "Good morning, Captain." Reed continued in the same professional tone. "Courtroom 3 is waiting for you. We have been looking throughout the building." Marcus smiled faintly. "I apologize for the delay. Officer Walker believed he needed additional information, and I chose to cooperate until the facts could be verified." Ethan remained silent for a moment before asking, almost automatically, "You are Judge Bennett?" Marcus looked directly at him and answered without the slightest trace of resentment. "Yes, I am. However, I believed it was more important that this interaction proceed according to normal procedure than according to my title." The realization settled heavily across everyone standing nearby. The attorneys who recognized Marcus quietly lowered their voices. Emily Foster emerged from the courthouse entrance, visibly relieved to see him safe. "Your Honor, everyone has been searching for you," she said. Marcus offered an apologetic smile. "I know, Emily. Thank you for your concern." Reed then turned toward Ethan, speaking respectfully but firmly. "Officer Walker, we will ensure the courthouse schedule is adjusted. At this point, please preserve every record related to this encounter exactly as it exists." Ethan nodded immediately. "My body camera has remained active the entire time." Reed acknowledged the response. "Good. Courthouse exterior cameras also recorded the interaction, and I understand members of the public may have additional recordings. We will allow the review process to examine everything objectively." Marcus listened quietly before adding, "That is the correct approach. Facts deserve the opportunity to speak before opinions do." His words carried no accusation. If anything, they reflected the same principle he had applied throughout his years on the bench. Around the plaza, several people who had been recording with their phones slowly lowered their devices. The television crew exchanged surprised looks after realizing that their continuous wide-angle footage had unintentionally documented the entire encounter from beginning to end. No one had anticipated becoming a witness to an event that would soon receive extraordinary attention. Ethan finally looked directly at Marcus. "Judge Bennett, I was not aware of your identity." Marcus answered gently, "Officer, identities are sometimes hidden. Respect should never be." The sentence lingered in the quiet morning air longer than anyone expected. Reed gave a slight nod, recognizing the significance of those words. They reflected neither triumph nor humiliation. They reflected responsibility. Marcus glanced toward the courthouse entrance where litigants, attorneys, and court staff still waited for proceedings to begin. "People have cases that deserve to be heard today," he said calmly. "Their time matters. Let us make certain they are not delayed any longer than necessary." Even after everything that had happened, his first concern remained the citizens depending upon the court. Reed stepped aside to clear the path toward the entrance, while Ethan remained standing where he was, watching the judge walk toward the courthouse with the same quiet dignity he had displayed since the first moment of their conversation. Behind them, the cameras continued recording exactly as they always had, preserving not only what people said, but also how they chose to conduct themselves when no one yet realized history was quietly being documented in real time. Judge Marcus Bennett entered courtroom 3 only a few minutes behind schedule, and every person present rose as he took his place behind the bench. The familiar rhythm of the courtroom returned almost immediately, yet those who had witnessed the unusual delay understood that the morning had already become anything but ordinary. Marcus greeted the attorneys, confirmed the revised schedule, and thanked everyone for their patience without offering any explanation beyond saying that an unexpected matter outside the courthouse had required additional attention. He believed the courtroom existed to resolve the concerns of the public, not the personal experiences of the judge presiding over it. As the first hearing began, Captain Michael Reed assembled a small administrative review team in a conference room overlooking the courthouse plaza. The purpose was not to assign blame before examining the evidence. It was to ensure that every available recording was preserved exactly as it existed before memories could influence perceptions. Officer Ethan Walker voluntarily submitted the recording from his body camera without hesitation. Courthouse security copied footage from the exterior surveillance system. The television station agreed to preserve its uninterrupted wide-angle recording after learning that it might assist in official review. Even the college student who had been filming the courthouse architecture contacted courthouse staff after seeing news of the unusual delay, explaining that the camera had remained pointed toward the entrance for nearly the entire morning. For independent recordings now documented the same encounter from different perspectives. None relied upon opinion. None depended upon recollection. Each quietly reflected the same sequence of events. Captain Reed watched the recordings carefully, sometimes replaying individual moments more than once. He paid attention not only to words spoken, but also to tone, timing, and opportunities where additional clarification might have changed the direction of the conversation. The review revealed a professional interaction that had gradually become unnecessarily prolonged because incomplete information had never been verified against readily available courthouse resources. Nothing suggested hostility. Nothing suggested resistance. Instead, the evidence demonstrated how quickly assumptions could extend an encounter that might have ended within moments had communication occurred differently. Ethan sat silently during portions of the review, taking notes as each recording played. He listened to his own questions, observed Marcus Bennett's calm responses, and noticed details he had missed while standing in the middle of the situation. He saw how patiently Marcus had waited before answering every request. He heard the courtesy that had remained consistent from beginning to end. Most importantly, he realized that the recordings captured something impossible to appreciate in real time. Confidence without complete information could easily resemble certainty, even when certainty did not yet exist. Meanwhile, Judge Bennett completed the morning docket with the same thoughtful attention he brought to every case. During a short recess, Emily Foster quietly informed him that courthouse administrators had preserved all available recordings exactly as requested. Marcus nodded appreciatively. "That is how every review should begin," he said. "Evidence first. Conclusions afterward." Emily hesitated before asking whether he wished to submit a formal statement immediately. Marcus smiled gently. "There will be time for statements. Right now, the public deserves a court that remains focused on their cases." His answer reflected the philosophy that had defined his years on the bench. Personal circumstances could never become more important than the institution itself. By late afternoon, the review team had reached one unanimous conclusion. The recordings told a complete story because they agreed with one another in every meaningful respect. No single camera controlled the narrative. Together, they formed a factual timeline that required neither speculation nor exaggeration. Captain Reed prepared a report recommending that established procedures be carefully evaluated so similar misunderstandings could be resolved more efficiently in the future. As the courthouse emptied and the last rays of sunlight reflected across the front steps, Officer Walker stood quietly outside the same entrance where the morning had begun. For the first time that day, he looked toward the security cameras mounted above the plaza not as ordinary equipment, but as silent guardians of accountability. They had recorded every decision without favor, reminding everyone involved that the strongest protection for public trust was never pride or position. It was the willingness to let the facts speak with their own unmistakable voice. The following morning, the courthouse returned to its familiar rhythm, but the previous day's events had already begun moving through the proper administrative channels. Captain Michael Reed submitted the completed evidence package to the department's Professional Standards Division, including the body camera recording, courthouse surveillance footage, dispatch communications, written statements, and every available public recording that documented the encounter from beginning to end. The review would not be influenced by rumors, headlines, or public speculation. It would be guided by facts preserved in real time. Officer Ethan Walker reported for duty as scheduled before being informed that the department had opened a formal administrative review consistent with standard policy. The notice was delivered respectfully and without accusation. The purpose was not to determine guilt before examining every detail. It was to ensure that public confidence remained rooted in transparency and accountability. Ethan accepted the decision without argument. After watching the recordings himself, he understood why a careful review mattered. Looking back, he realized there had been several opportunities to verify information through courthouse personnel before allowing the encounter to continue. Experience had taught him to act decisively, but the recordings reminded him that decisive action and complete information must always travel together. Across town, Judge Marcus Bennett continued hearing cases exactly as he always had. Attorneys entering his courtroom found the same measured voice, the same patience, and the same commitment to treating every person with equal dignity regardless of background or profession. During a brief conversation with Emily Foster, she quietly asked whether he intended to issue a public statement about what had happened outside the courthouse. Marcus considered the question for a moment before replying. The process deserves the opportunity to work before opinions attempt to replace it. Institutions become stronger when they are allowed to correct themselves through honesty. Emily nodded, recognizing that his answer reflected the same principles he expected from everyone who appeared before his bench. Later that afternoon, Captain Reed requested a private meeting with Ethan. The conversation lasted less than 30 minutes, but its impact would remain with the officer for years. Reed placed several printed still images from the recordings on the conference table. None showed dramatic moments. Instead, they captured simple expressions, respectful responses, and ordinary decisions made during an ordinary morning. "Do you notice something?" Reed asked. Ethan studied each image carefully before answering. He cooperated from the beginning. Reed nodded. "Exactly. The recordings show that every opportunity existed to slow the pace, gather additional information, and confirm the facts. Professional judgment is not measured only by how quickly we act. It is also measured by knowing when to pause." Ethan quietly acknowledged the lesson. He understood that no amount of confidence could substitute for complete verification. Meanwhile, the television station decided not to sensationalize its footage. Instead, it produced a thoughtful report discussing the importance of body cameras, courthouse security systems, and objective evidence in strengthening public trust. Community leaders praised the decision to focus on accountability rather than controversy. Several legal organizations also commended the transparent preservation of every recording, noting that reliable evidence protected everyone involved, including officers, public officials, and private citizens alike. As the week progressed, the courthouse installed additional guidance reminding visitors where to seek assistance if questions arose before entering the building. The police department scheduled updated training emphasizing communication with courthouse personnel during encounters occurring on judicial property. None of those changes erased what had happened, but they demonstrated that meaningful accountability often appeared through improved practices rather than dramatic speeches. On Friday evening, as sunlight settled across the courthouse steps once again, Ethan paused before ending his shift and looked toward the entrance where the encounter had begun. The plaza appeared peaceful, filled with families, attorneys, employees, and visitors finishing another ordinary day. He understood now that public trust was built in moments so ordinary they rarely attracted attention until something unexpected occurred. The recordings had preserved more than a single interaction. They had preserved an opportunity to become better, and for institutions dedicated to justice, there could be no more valuable evidence than a lesson honestly learned. Several weeks later, the official review reached its conclusion, not through dramatic announcements or emotional debate, but through careful examination of every available fact. The findings confirmed that the encounter had been prolonged by incomplete verification and missed opportunities for communication. New recommendations were adopted by both the courthouse and the police department, emphasizing closer coordination between responding officers and courthouse personnel whenever questions arose on judicial property. The changes were practical rather than symbolic, designed to improve future decisions instead of simply revisiting past ones. Officer Ethan Walker accepted the outcome with humility. He completed additional professional training, participated in discussions about procedural judgment, and gradually came to understand that authority carried its greatest strength when paired with patience. He often replayed one particular moment from the body camera recording, not because it reflected his finest hour, but because it reminded him how easily confidence could outrun certainty. Over time, he discovered that acknowledging a mistake did not weaken professional character. It strengthened it. Judge Marcus Bennett never spoke publicly about himself as the center of the story. When reporters requested interviews, he politely declined to discuss personal recognition and instead encouraged attention toward the importance of reliable evidence, transparent procedures, and equal respect for every individual encountered by public institutions. During a judicial conference several months later, a young attorney asked him what lesson should be remembered from the incident. Marcus paused before answering. The law asks every person to trust a process that they cannot always see. That trust survives only when every participant values truth more than pride. The room remained silent for a moment as those words settled with unusual weight. They were not directed at one profession or one individual. They applied equally to everyone who carried responsibility. The courthouse itself soon returned to ordinary life. Families entered seeking resolutions. Business owners settled disputes. Jurors fulfilled their civic duty. Attorneys argued their cases with determination. Judges listened before deciding. Officers continued protecting the community. The routines that define justice rarely appear extraordinary, yet they quietly shape the lives of thousands of people every year. Outside the courthouse entrance, the same security cameras continued recording every morning without recognition or applause. They did not celebrate victories or criticize mistakes. They simply preserved the truth exactly as it unfolded. The television station eventually archived its footage after producing a thoughtful report that many local training programs later referenced as an example of why objective evidence benefits everyone involved. The college student whose architectural project had unintentionally captured another perspective completed the assignment without ever expecting the recording would contribute to a meaningful public review. Sometimes history is documented not by those searching for it, but by ordinary people simply observing the world around them. One quiet Friday morning, months after the encounter, Ethan happened to arrive at the courthouse on unrelated business. As he crossed the plaza, he noticed Judge Bennett approaching from the opposite direction carrying the same familiar briefcase. Their eyes met, and both men slowed their pace. Ethan spoke first. "Good morning, Your Honor." Marcus smiled warmly. "Good morning, Officer Walker." There was no lingering resentment between them, only mutual understanding shaped by experience. Ethan nodded respectfully. "I appreciate the lesson, even though I wish I had learned it differently." Marcus answered with the calm confidence that had defined every moment of their first meeting. The most valuable lessons usually arrive without invitation. What matters is whether we allow them to improve the next decision. They exchanged a simple handshake before continuing toward their separate responsibilities. Neither looked back. They did not need to. The real ending had never been about embarrassment or revenge. It had always been about choosing integrity after the facts became clear. As the courthouse doors opened and another ordinary day of hearings began, sunlight reflected across the stone entrance exactly as it had on the morning when two strangers first met. The building stood as a quiet reminder that justice is not measured by titles, uniforms, or assumptions. It is measured by the courage to seek the truth before reaching a conclusion. Because the strongest institutions are not those that never make mistakes, but those willing to learn from them with honesty, humility, and unwavering respect for every person who stands before the law.